days of Herod, which is where we had stopped last time, we enter some of the most critically important as well as potentially confusing years of the intertestamental period. It will be very important to understand the political setting of Judea and the life of Jesus and the apostles to understand something of Herod the Great. We ended last time discussing a little about him and his brother, and particularly his father, Antipater, who has brought about some of the results in the appointments of Herod and his brother Phaziel. We're going to say a little bit about him tonight. He will be our primary topic next time we discuss ITP. And then with the remainder of the session tonight, we'll be back to Rome. In other words, kind of what we are doing on your chart with the gray line that gives us our leaders in Israel, and down towards the bottom, our leaders in Rome. We're kind of like, for one time, we're discussing them, and the next time we're discussing them, and the next time it's kind of back and forth like this to show you the process of what we're doing. We're going to be through with that eventually, and that means that there's always a little bit of overlapping. In other words, we're going to go all the way down to 30 BC tonight, but then we'll have to jump back up to around 40 BC starting next time. So that's like we've gone to 30 BC here, and then next week we'll have to jump up to 40 and go over like that, just because we have to backtrack and cover some of the material that was not covered concerning one or the other of these two places, either what's going on in Rome or what's going on down in Israel. So far, Antipater has been the interesting figure. We don't know a whole lot about him, and he's important. He really doesn't do much, except he's kind of the foundation stone for his two sons, and particularly for Herod. Herod will be the most important. But he's the scene behind the scenes. He has been the force behind the force all of these years in Israel. And more or less we can say he's finally rewarded in the year 47 BC, at least with an official title. He's granted a formal position and title as a leader, a governor in Judea. That probably doesn't mean a whole lot to Antipater, because he's been the power behind the power of Hyrcanus II now for quite some period of time. He's not too interested in titles anyway. He just wants the power that exists there to govern Israel, and so he's been important for that. Starting with 47 BC, he's going to continue to rule for only 4 years, but he'll be ruling side by side with Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus actually will outlive him by about 4 years. Hyrcanus will be the religious leader. He's the high priest. If you go back to Hyrcanus II, he's the high priest, beginning in 63. Also notice there the ethnarch. Well, the ethnarch is a political position. High priest is a religious position. So, in other words, beginning in 47 BC, Hyrcanus II would really cease being the ethnarch in Judea. He would remain with his religious title as well as position of high priest, and Antipater would take over the political scene, being made the governor of Judea. And he'll continue that only for a few years. Now, we also were discussing the First Triumvirate last time, and we were discussing Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus in reverse order, Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. We came right down to the Ides of March the 15th, 44 BC, the date of the assassination of Julius Caesar. Let's get a little bit into that, which will bring us into this Jewish aspect of things tonight. There are 4 important figures in Rome around the time of Caesar's assassination, all 4 of which you need to be familiar with, particularly the latter 2 of the 4. There are 4 important men. First of all, there were 2 leading men in Caesar's assassination. So in other words, we're going to give you 2 men who were against Caesar and 2 who are for him, and the 2 that are for him are more important. There were 2 leading men in Caesar's assassination. One was his best friend, Brutus, B-R-U-T-U-S. His best friend, Brutus, who was a conspirator and who was one of the assassinators, and who was a political and military figure as well. And the second was Cassius, C-A-S-S-I-U-S. He appears temporarily for a period of 2 years on your chart as the governor or legate of Syria. C-A-S-S-I-U-S, Cassius. Cassia was a Roman general and a Roman politician as well. Brutus and Cassius, then, are the two leading men in Caesar's assassination. By leading, we speak of the plotters of the assassination. Brutus being his best friend, and Brutus being one of those many who carried it out that morning on the Senate floor. Then we have two important men on his side. Now, you've probably heard of the name Brutus, maybe Cassia, but probably these other two names will be even more familiar. These, just because of the important events surrounding Julius Caesar, who was an important figure himself, then these four men more or less have tagged along as becoming important, typical names in people's memory from your school days. Brutus and Cassia. Then he has two on his side. One, Mark Antony, a former lieutenant in the Roman army, what we would speak of as a lieutenant. Mark Antony. Sometimes it's spelled Anthony with an H in it, as it is on the chart, I believe. But it's pronounced Antony, and I think more typically it will be spelled without the H. His name appears once as a governor in Syria on your chart, and once as the first of the three members of the Second Triumvirate, both of which times the name occurs A-N-T-H-O-N-Y. I would prefer to spell it A-N-T-O-N-Y, Antony. Antony. Mark Antony and Octavian, which I've always thought was a fascinating name, Octavian, but I don't know if you could get by with it in today's society. O-C-T-A-V-I-A-N, Octavian, from whom we derive the name of our month, October. Octavian, October. This business of sodomite shoes. How does that come into Octavian? Well, you know, you're concerned about someone else may have started this movement of wearing a certain type of shoes or a certain type of purse. Well, you could really never go around calling the month October, October. It's named after some pagan Roman general who became an emperor. And it was part of emperor worship there. And the month August is named after him as well. And July after Julius Caesar. How can we even use a calendar that's based on the Julian calendar of Julius Caesar? So if you try to trace everything back to its origin, you'll find the devil probably somewhere back there. And that would put you in such a bind you really couldn't do anything. He was a grandnephew. Many times you'll see him referred to as the son of Caesar. But really he was a grandnephew, and he was an adopted son of Julius Caesar. Two men against Caesar, Brutus and Cassia. Two men for him or on his side, Mark Antony, lower level officer in the Roman army, and Octavian, grandnephew and adopted son. Caesar is assassinated in the spring, the Ides of March the 15th, 44 BC. A month or so after that, early summer, 44 BC, Cassia goes to Syria. Let's see what happens on the anti-side of the Caesar ledger, those that are against him, Brutus and Cassia. In 44 BC, Cassia goes to Syria to take over Syria because of the confusion, just utter confusion, surrounding Caesar's assassination. And he remains there for 2 years. Cassia remains there from 44 down to 42 BC. This is all on that line of Syrian governors, beginning with the general under Pompey, Scaurus. We haven't mentioned too many of these. I just said we'd mention some of the important ones. We see Crassus, we see Cassia earlier, which is really not important there. We mentioned Sextus Caesar, not that important except that he appoints Herod as governor of Cilicia. The others are not that important until you get down to 44 all the way down to 31 BC, and then you go for 2 years with Cassia, and then the remaining period from 42 to down to 31 with Mark Antony. So he goes down there. Keep in mind kind of all of why we're saying this and what's supposed to be tying together here. Cassia is one of those conspirators who plotted the assassination of Caesar, and he goes to Syria. Remember, Rome at this time is greatly expanding her empire, but it's always toward the east here. She's very concerned about Syria. She's very concerned about Palestine. because of that other major power in that general part of the world of that day, and that's the Parthians that I had drawn up here way over on the far right, your right, my left of our chart up here. And they want to get over there and control things like Syria and Palestine because of the threat of a Parthian invasion of some of these newly annexed provinces that belong to the Roman Empire. And so whenever he gets over to Syria, then remember meanwhile, down in Palestine, you've got Antipater and his two sons, Herod and Phaziel, who are controlling different parts. Antipater is controlling down the southern part of Palestine along with his son Phaziel. Herod is controlling Galilee. He's been made the prefect of Galilee. He's also controlling Cilicia at this time, so he's controlling up north in Palestine. These men, being the opportunists that they were at one time on Caesar's side. Remember, Caesar was the one they had sent. Well, I have to back up a little further. Whenever Caesar ended up down in Egypt, he was blockaded down there, remember. And I said he was blockaded until reinforcements were sent. And among others, Antipater and his two sons, Herod and Phaziel, were involved in sending reinforcements down there. With them, of course, realizing that if I scratch Caesar's back, one day Caesar will scratch my back, which is precisely what happened. Whenever Caesar returns home, he returns via Palestine and Syria. And so he appoints them leaders of these various areas as he goes through. So they were on the side of Caesar until one of Caesar's foes now comes over to Syria and it makes himself more or less the legate or the governor there. And therefore, being the opportunists that they were, now they're going to switch sides. And we'll see this take place a lot with Herod. He was not one that one could trust at all. So being the opportunists that they were, they set out to gain the favor of Cassia in 44 B.C., who's come over to be the legate or the governor of Syria. The way they're going to do this is by raising tax money, excessive raising of tax money, from Palestine. Therefore it's from the Jews, therefore it's just more of a problem, a compounded problem here as far as Herod and his relationship to the Jews is concerned. He was appointed by a Roman, he's descended from Esau, and now he increases taxes. And that always makes people mad whenever their leaders increase taxes. So now they've got three reasons why they wouldn't like Herod. Well, Herod then is given the title, at least the title, of Procurator of Judea by Cassia. That really puts him then over his father and over his other brother, Phaziel, who were the two leaders down in Judea. Now this is important because it introduces us to Herod and his control of southern Palestine, namely Jerusalem, and we know Bethlehem to be right in the confines of Jerusalem, that is in the close proximity, which then would introduce us to the story of the so-called slaughter of the innocents over in the second chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. In other words, we have to be aware of how Herod goes from way up here of Galilee of the Gentiles and ending up controlling territory down there in Judea. We know his father Antipater was made the leader and Phaziel one under him, and therefore how could he have been the one really to give the edict and to have it carried out of the slaughter of the innocents at Bethlehem around 5 B.C. over in Matthew chapter 2. So he's promised with the title, it's a title that he's given, Procurator of Syria, or we might even say Prefect of Syria. He's promised that he's going to be given the kingship of Judea in the future. Notice how you have him on your chart, Herod the Great, King of Judea. So we have to understand how this came about. We're not going to get to that tonight, but we're going to set the scene for that, and we will be there next time. We have seen him, therefore, just to kind of recap Herod thus far, we've seen him made, first of all, the ruler in Galilee. Then secondly, by Sextus Caesar, he's made governor of Cilicia, which is on your chart, 47 B.C. Galilee, let's say Palestine runs this way on our board up here, Galilee's here, and Cilicia is up here. Kind of a buffer zone between Syria, Phoenicia, kind of controls Phoenicia, between Syria and northern Israel or Galilee. Then we see at the same time, around 44 B.C., he is, or 3 years later from this time on the chart, 44 B.C., he's given the title Procurator of Judea. and he has promised the kingship. That is, if he does a good job, he has promised the kingship in Judea in the future. Now, the next year, 43 B.C., which you have on your chart, a fanatical Jew poisoned Antipater, which brings to an end this obscure man's life who's been the power behind the power and the scene behind the scenes now for several decades in Jewish political circles. He's only actually had an official position and an official title for 4 years, Antipater, from 47 down to 43 B.C. But a good loyalist among the Jews, a fanatical Jew, poisoned Antipater in 43 B.C., poisoned him to death. He didn't survive. He dies in 43. That then leaves his 2 sons, Herod and Phaziel, controlling everything from Syria right through Cilicia and Galilee, all the way down to Judea. Maybe I need to kind of put some of my earlier work up here, the Mediterranean world, because we're going to need this again here in a moment. Maybe I can enlarge Palestine over there. Some of you, I know this helps. Some of you, you're already familiar with it. Let's end it right here, and then I'll enlarge Palestine. Let's say we have Italy. This is not drawn to scale. There we have Italy. Okay, then here's Palestine. So we'll move Palestine over here and enlarge it. And here we'll have, here's like Lake Hula. Mount Hermon is up here, and this is a little stream that comes from Caesarea Philippi that empty into Sea of Galilee, that empties into Jordan River, that empties into Dead Sea, something like that, which would give us Jerusalem about here, Bethlehem here. Let's just say this is Samaria right in between. This would be Galilee. This would be Syria, probably off the map. And then somewhere in here we would have Cilicia along there. To let you know what we're talking about here. We'll get to this map in a moment. So that means that when in 43 B.C., whenever Antipater is assassinated, that leaves his 2 sons, Herod and Phaziel, in control of everything from Syria, not including Syria, but let's say south of Syria, through Cilicia, through Galilee, through Samaria, all the way down here to Judea. You can spell Judea like many of these terms in one of 2 ways. You can either spell it with the A or leave the A, or drop the A. The A is an old form of spelling these words. It depends on who you read or what period. Judea, or the AE together is pronounced as an E. Okay, you understand that so far? That brings us, let's see, up on the gray, on the gray bar, that really only brings us in down to 43. That doesn't get into Antigonus and the dotted line, king, high priest, Parthian invasion, Herod appointed king, Herod captures Jerusalem, beginning of his reign, all of that, Herod the Great, Aristobulus III. Just brings us down to 43 B.C., the death of Antipater, which then moves official practical control into the hands of his sons, Herod and Phaziel, of everything from southern Judea right down to the border. We could even draw, really the Nabatean Empire would start about there. You can spell that with the A or drop it as well. Everything from the Nabatean kingdom all the way up through Judea, through Samaria, through Galilee, through Cilicia to the southern part of Syria. Now let's, on this line I had down here, let's go back to Rome and see what's going on here. We're still going in chronological order here, though. In 42 B.C., Cassius and Brutus are the 2 conspirators against Julius Caesar, and Cassius has been in Syria as the legate or governor from 44 to 42 B.C. In 42 B.C., the combined forces of Brutus and Cassius meet the combined forces of Antony and Octavian. That's why I gave you those four names earlier, because those are four important names, 2 for and 2 against the side of Julius Caesar. The combined forces of Brutus and Cassia meet the combined forces of Antony and Octavian at Philippi. A lot of these cities were important in centuries gone by. They're well known to you because of the New Testament, the book of Philippians, saints at Philippi, or Philippi, it can be pronounced either way. But the battle at Philippi, in 42 BC, Brutus and Cassia meet and are defeated by Mark Antony and Octavian, the adopted son and grandnephew of Julius Caesar. Now remember, Herod had been on the side of Caesar, and then whenever he's assassinated by Brutus and Cassius moves to Syria to set up his governorship there, then Herod swaps sides from Caesar's side over to the side of Cassia. Now Cassia and Brutus have been defeated by Antony and Octavian at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, so being the opportunist that he was, Herod switches his loyalty again back to the Caesar side, this time back to Mark Antony. Of the two men, Octavian and Antony by far is the more important of the two during the initial phase of their relationship. So Mark Antony is really one up on Octavian at this time. What does Herod receive as a result of his being the ever opportunist that he was? Well, Herod and his brother Phaziel are appointed tetrarchs of Israel. They are appointed tetrarchs of Israel. Tetrarchs. That may not be on the chart anywhere. Tetrarchs, which meant they were supposed to control a tetrarchy. But the term was more or less used in a general sense by this period of its etymology anyway. Herod and Phaziel are appointed tetrarchs of Israel in 42 BC, and Hyrcanus II just continues right along as he always has in the background to be the high priest. Hyrcanus II, remember, is the passive of the two brothers, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II. Hyrcanus never really wanted to do much, so now he has been overshadowed by his brother Aristobulus II all along, and he's been overshadowed by Antipater all along. And now he's overshadowed by Herod and Phaziel as well. The two Edomites, remember. In 40 BC, now we are getting to something else on the chart. In 40 BC, the Parthians attack and capture Syria. Then they are invited by Israel to come on down and meet the Jews, and so they do, and they capture Jerusalem. And the one they're invited by is one Antigonus, who was the surviving son of Aristobulus II. And because he does the inviting, that means him being the opportunist that he was, that he's going to get some reward out of this, and it's going to hurt Herod and Phaziel. I guess it does relate for a moment anyway to Israel, so we're back up on the gray horizontal bar on your chart. I see a notation there, 40 BC, a vertical note, Herod is appointed king. And then you see to the right of that, Parthian invasion. You see that on your chart? Those two should be reversed. The Parthian invasion comes first. I mean, because we English people think from left to right. So we think Herod was appointed king, and then either the next day or month or year, the Parthian invasion took place. No, the Parthian invasion took place first. So I have them reversed on my chart because it really should go on the left of the notation about Herod. So the Parthians, and we had this up, forget that this is Israel over here, and now here's Israel. Here's the Sea of Galilee, and here's the Dead Sea. in Jerusalem and so forth. Then here's the Parthian Empire, probably extending, let's see, here's Syria. And you've got Black Sea and Caspian Sea. Let's say something like this. And then on over this direction. All of this would be the Parthian Empire. And we've got like Tigris River like this, something like this, Euphrates River like that. Here we're over into Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Syria, Phoenicia, and all the way up to Syria there. Although I didn't go far enough up, not drawn to scale again. They are invited over, I said, by Antigonus. Now, why would Antigonus be inviting the Parthians? They sack Antioch and Damascus, which means they control Syria, which obviously means we're going to have war on our hands between the Romans and the Parthians. They are the two leading empires in that part of the world in that day. Well, it's because Antigonus, he's still part of the Hasmonean dynasty. You see, he's descended from Aristobulus II. He is the sole surviving son of Aristobulus II. Herod and Phaziel are two Edomites, Idumeans. He, in other words, would see himself as being legitimate because he is descended in the Hasmonean dynasty. Therefore, obviously, if he has any political notions in his mind at all, he then would want to control his native land, Israel. So whenever the Parthians invade and capture Syria in 40 BC, he invites them to Israel, and they come and they capture Jerusalem, and as a result of his invitation, as you have on your chart, Antigonus is made king and high priest by the Parthians. Now we have the Parthians entering the Jewish picture here, which is something we really haven't had before. And now we're going to have a whole change of events, different than what we've seen before. So let me give you some conclusions or some results of the Parthian invasion. All it says is Parthian invasion. You almost need to know that in the same year, 40 BC, the Parthians invade victoriously both Syria and Israel. So some results or some conclusions of the Parthian invasion. First of all, what happened to Hyrcanus II? Hyrcanus II. He would be the uncle, right, of Antigonus. And Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus were brothers. So he would be the uncle of the sole surviving son of Aristobulus II, Antigonus. What happens to Hyrcanus II? He was this passive, nice, gentle high priest for all of these decades now. Well, he's placed in prison, and he has his ears cropped by the Parthians. That's literal cropping of his ears. Why? Why do that to someone? Cut off part of his ear. To have him not be able to hear? Well, not really. Well, it's because, according to the Old Testament, those with deformities could not serve as high priests. They could not serve in an official religious position like that if there was any blemish or deformity to the person's body. Just like whenever an animal sacrifice was brought, it had to be what? Holy and without blemish. And so would the high priest have to fit that type or that pattern as well. So all you have to do is lop off one of his fingers, and he can forever, after that, never be the high priest. So instead of a finger, they crop his ears. And this would successfully thwart him ever getting out of prison, by popular revolt of the people or something, and being reinstituted as high priest. That's what happens to Hyrcanus II. What happens to Phaziel? We've got three leaders, in other words, in Israel. Hyrcanus, Phaziel, and of course Herod. What happens to Phaziel? Phaziel is put in prison where he commits suicide. Maybe we could say Hyrcanus II fared a little better than did Phaziel. What happens to Herod? Well, he's on your chart after this date, so he didn't commit suicide. You might think, well, I know what Herod would have done. Being the opportunist that he was, he would have said, Parthians, I've always been in favor of your extremely good military activities and tactics. You're much better than the Romans. No, this time he didn't. What Herod saw at this time, that would have been a good guess, but it would have been a wrong guess. Herod at this time had seen enough of the inside workings of the Roman Empire to know that the Roman Empire was the empire with which one should stay. Don't go to the Parthians. Now you can swap back and forth from a pro to an anti-Caesar position, or a pro-Cassia position, or a pro-Mark Antony position, but either way you go, you're still with the Romans there. We're still talking about the Romans there. Don't go for the Parthians, because they're not going to stand a chance whenever Rome gets back on her feet and does something about the invasion of these two eastern provinces of hers, Syria and Judea, or Syria and Israel. Herod, whenever Jerusalem is attacked and sacked, escapes secretly with an entourage all the way to Rome. He's going to get to Rome and then say, I did the best that I could, and the Parthians came, and cry on everyone's shoulder, and I'm sure he'll get something out of that, being the opportunist that he was. There are three results then of the Parthian invasion that are particularly significant from the Jewish point of view. Hyrcanus II is deposed from high priesthood, Phaziel is imprisoned and commits suicide, and Herod, the worst of the three, escapes to Rome. The next year, 39 BC, the Parthians are driven out of Israel and driven out of Syria by the Romans.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape over.
Year 39 BC, the Parthians are driven out of Israel and driven out of Syria by the Romans. That's precisely what Herod suspected all along. He anticipated the overpowering ability of the Romans versus the Parthian Empire. So wisely he chooses to stay with the Roman Empire. In 39 BC, which I don't guess we're given anything really about that on the chart. They can only give so much on a map like this anyway. The Parthians are driven out, but it takes a few years for Rome to get her feet back on the ground in this extreme eastern province of hers, Syria, which really controls Judea as well, and to really set everything in order again. Therefore, meanwhile, Antigonus stays as king and high priest. My reason for going through all of that is to explain the dotted line. I've always got an explanation for why all of these various things are drawn on here, because they were drawn for a reason. Just like under the name of Aristobulus II, we see a dotted line there on your chart, because control was kind of back and forth between Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II. So we see a dotted line under the name Antigonus, king and high priest, because he had been made king and high priest by the Parthians in 40 BC, but the next year in 39 BC, the Parthians were expelled from Judea and from Syria. Therefore, he's still leader, he's still king and high priest. That's only because it's going to take Rome a little time to get on her feet again in this area. So we could say in one sense of the word, he's really not leader. He's really not king or high priest, because we know, since it now officially belongs again to Rome, whenever Rome does get on her feet again, then Rome is going to put out Antigonus, because Antigonus was the very one who invited the Parthians down to Judea whenever they'd invaded Syria anyway. So that would only make sense then. Getting back to Herod, Herod arrives in Rome late in the year, the fall of the year 40 BC. He's come to meet Mark Antony and Octavian. He presents his case before them. Now his father has been poisoned, remember. Antipater has been poisoned 3 years earlier in 43 BC. His brother now has committed suicide. That really leaves Herod then. Herod as the surviving member of the Antipater family. So he presents his case before the Romans that he has done everything possible to counteract Antigonus and to counteract the Parthians and the Parthian invasion. And they were invaded, and there was nothing really he could do about that but flee and escape to Rome and hope to get reinforcements, so that he can come back. Whenever he presents his case before Antony and Octavian, they accept all of the premises that are stated by Herod. They recognize that Herod can play an extremely important role back in Judea for them, simply because Herod is so committed to the Roman cause. Therefore, there's really no way in the world they're going to allow Antigonus to remain in control there. They see that Antigonus is pro-Parthian and Herod is extremely pro-Roman. And because he's so pro-Rome and pro the Roman cause and the Roman way, then he is declared in the year 40 BC to be king of Judea by an official statement of the Roman Senate under the leadership of Antony and Octavian. Now remember I said earlier that whenever he was made procurator of Judea, then he was promised the title king. He was promised the kingship of Judea in the future if he proved worthy. So this just brings a second part to the first part of this story of the kingship of Herod the Great, in that now he not is promised the kingship, but he actually is given the official position and designation and title as Herod, King of the Jews, King of Judea. Now, just because he's proclaimed king, now that's on your chart. Now, that should be now on the right of the note about the Parthian invasion, because notice how it comes after that. So you almost have a little mistake here on the chart. The Parthian invasion came first. That was the impetus that sent Herod to Rome, and then that was the cause, him presenting his case before Antony and Octavian, that actually gave him the appointment of the kingship. Herod appointed king. Appointed king of what? In 40 BC, appointed king of Judea, which would really in effect make him king of Israel, but technically they're right here on the chart up on the gray horizontal bar, Herod the Great, king of Judea. Now he got the name the Great, that designation the Great, that probably came from Josephus, because there were other Herods, and to distinguish this Herod from all the other Herods, let's distinguish him by Herod the Great, because he probably was the most significant of them all. Well, certainly he was, because all of the other Herods descended from this Herod. That makes him the most important. Just because we have this second link in the story fulfilled of Herod's kingship, one, he was promised it in the future if he does well. Two, he's given the designation. Three, he has to carry that out. He has to enforce it. When does it really become a reality in his life? Well, we're going to drop that right now. But remember where we are, and we'll pick that up next week then. We'll have to finish the third part of the story of Herod's kingship. Meanwhile, we're going to switch back to the politics in Rome. One of these days we'll be through with Rome and we'll just be dealing there with Palestine. But meanwhile, back at the ranch, we're going to have to deal with the politics in Rome. That then brings us to our discussion this evening of the Second Triumvirate, made up of the triumvirs Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. So we would just briefly discuss these three men, distinguishing the one from the other, and rule out Lepidus fairly quickly, and then discuss what happens and how it happens between Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar Augustus, who becomes later Caesar Augustus. Okay, let's start with Lepidus. These names are on your chart. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. M-A-R-C-U-S. Marcus Aemilius, A-E-M-I-L-I-U-S. Aemilius Lepidus. L-E-P-I-D-U-S. Lepidus was the commander of the armed forces under Julius Caesar whenever Caesar became emperor. Remember, he was declared by the Roman Senate emperor for life, once he had subdued both the Roman Senate and Pompey as well. He was the commander-in-chief, we could say, of the armed forces under Julius Caesar. That made him important just because of that. In other words, he has a military background. All of these men have a political background as well. To be in the military is to be in politics, although it's not necessarily true of the reverse. To be in politics is to be in the military, but to be in the military is to be in politics, and that's almost true today as well. Well, it's true. Depends on what part of the military we're talking about, but if you go up far enough, to be in the military is to be in politics. these chiefs of staff, joint chiefs of staff, and retired generals, they have a lot of sway. They have a lot of sway in political circles. He also was the man with whom Caesar dined on March the 14th, 44 BC. Remember I said that Caesar had dined out the night before he was assassinated. This was the night of the storms and the goblins and witches and the omens and the ravens crowing in the middle of the night and all of this business. You have to ask somebody that was out on the streets that night whether all of that really happened, but that's what history tells us. Mark Antony. Mark Antony was a lower level Roman officer. Lower level, what makes him so important? He was the one who delivered a very famous speech over Caesar's dead body. Stirred up so much excitement in the people that they burned Caesar's corpse. But he's on the Caesar side, though. He delivered a very famous speech over Caesar's body. Right after 11 a.m., then on the morning of March the 15th, 44 BC, after he was assassinated. So this, in other words, gave him a high position of prestige then. Octavian was the grandnephew of Caesar, adopted son of his, was only 18 years of age at the time of Caesar's death. In other words, we almost have another young Alexander the Great on our hands. He does become extremely well known, Octavian. Better known than Lepidus and Mark Antony. So he's just a young man. Remember Alexander the Great, the beginning of his conquest, was just a young man of 20 years of age. So he's only 18 years old. So now look on your chart, we have our Second Triumvirate form. First made up of Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. This made up of Lepidus, Antony, and Octavian. And first of all, let's deal with Lepidus. Lepidus drops out rather early. Remember, Crassus had been killed early in the First Triumvirate whenever he went over into Syria and tried to make a military name of renown for himself. We don't have to deal much with Lepidus simply because Lepidus drops out relatively early. And the other two ruled together for a remarkably long period of time, over a decade. They rule side by side, Antony and Octavian. Whenever Crassus had been killed and therefore of necessity had dropped out of the First Triumvirate, remember that really, along with another situation, the death of Julia, the daughter of Caesar, who had been married to Pompey, that's what really brought about all of the series of events of the striving for sole leadership between Caesar and Pompey. That brought about the problems. That brought about all of the conclusions and finally resulting in Caesar's assassination. Pompey's defeat and then Caesar's assassination. What about this Second Triumvirate? In other words, I said last time, whenever you have three, it seems like there's a balance there. Whenever you have two, it's just one-on-one. Three, it adds one more member in there to keep a balance. Well, with the Second Triumvirate, we don't have the same thing happen as we did with the first. Just because Lepidus drops out doesn't mean, although it probably should have meant, but it doesn't mean that Antony and Octavian go at one another's throat immediately. For a period of over a decade, they are able to rule well, and they're able to rule side by side. And of course, we know that's not going to last forever, but it does last for a while. And what made it not last forever was again something that concerned marital relationships. That was part of the problem between Caesar and Pompey. The daughter of Caesar, Julia, had been given to Pompey in marriage, and she died. Not mysteriously, she died. But that just doesn't look very good in Caesar's eyes whenever this is going on with Pompey, and this was his own daughter. What's the marital situation here? Well, it was as follows. Antony had married the sister of Octavian, whose name was Octavia, feminine form, which I've also thought is a pretty name. Maybe you can name your next daughter Octavia. an astounding name as far as I'm concerned. I'm attracted to the names, but we picked Jennifer instead. Antony had married the sister of Octavian, whose name was Octavia. So get that down, because that's the key to all of this. But in 40 BC, Antony had gone down to Egypt, where he too, just like Caesar before him, had fallen in love with the mystique of Egyptian culture and history, and B, fallen in love with this beautiful, mysterious young woman, Cleopatra the Seventh. He fell in love with Cleopatra just like Caesar had before, and just like, I guess, Pompey had before. Cleopatra has had many suitors then. So he falls in love in 40 BC with Cleopatra the Seventh down in Egypt. In 32 BC, he sent formal letters of divorce to Octavia. And big brothers never like treatment like that of little sisters. Notice the date, 32 BC. He's been in love with Cleopatra for 8 years now, had a relationship going for 8 years. All the while, he's still married to the sister of Octavian, Octavia. This, of course, infuriated Octavian. And so this, combined with all of the various other political events that are taking place, brings the ultimate showdown for sole leadership of the Roman Empire. See where I'm making the X right there? At 12 noon on the day of the 2nd of September, 31 BC, off the coast of northwest Greece, the two men and their armies, Octavian and Antony, met for the final naval showdown known in history as the Battle of Actium. I think your chart has a wrong date there by 1 year. You'll see both dates in reading 32 or 31 BC, but I have always been taught 31, and in kind of researching that, 31 seems to be the more prevalent of the two. So we'll go with a revised chart. 31 BC. That's a vertical note on your chart. At noon on September the 2nd, 31 BC, off the northwest coast of Greece, Octavian and Antony meet in one of the greatest battles of history. How many of you have heard of the Battle of Actium? We have some people. The Battle of Actium, one of the greatest battles of history. Why? Because it's going to decide the next Roman emperor. And of course we can only, with hindsight, speculate, well, if it would have been Antony, if he would have won, I wonder what the Roman Empire would have turned out to be like. Well, that's just speculation. But we know what it turned out to be like with Augustus Caesar on the throne. And he's the one that brought the stability to the Roman Empire and maybe calls it then to last for another 5 centuries. Well, as the battle progressed early in the afternoon, mid-afternoon, up into late afternoon, a naval battle, Antony began to lose. Whenever Cleopatra, who was there with her ships as well, they had all come from Egypt up here for this final showdown. Whenever Cleopatra saw Antony begin to lose, who likes a loser? And this was the man with whom, well, I can't say with whom she had been in love, but he had been in love with her for the past many years now. Whenever she saw him begin to lose, she turned back toward Egypt with all of her ships, headed home. And the weak, lovesick Mark Antony decided to follow her and leave all of his men behind to see what they could do to Octavian. He leaves all of his men. He's got one ship, and he follows his lover Cleopatra and her entourage back to Egypt. And reading a couple of paragraphs from someone else's account, here possibly is what happened. No one really knows, but here possibly is what happened. Whenever Antony and Cleopatra arrived in Egypt, here the last act of their tragedy was played. The Roman armies, they had defeated Antony's army by this time. The Roman armies reached the environs of Alexandria, and Cleopatra determined to rid herself of Antony. He's a loser. No woman really likes a lovesick, weak loser trailing after her like that. She barricaded herself in a monument with two of her women and made Antony to think that she had committed suicide. Antony, according to plan, thrust his sword into his body. She wanted him to think that she had committed suicide to cause him to commit suicide so she could come out of the monument and live after all. According to plan, he thrust his sword into his body, but did not succeed in taking his own life. Must have missed his heart or gallbladder or whatever. Cleopatra and her women drew the badly wounded Antony into the monument. His corpse was found there later by the Romans whenever they broke into it. It is suspected, can't be proven, but it is suspected, that Cleopatra realized her chances of making terms with the Romans would be enhanced if she could rid herself of the loser Mark Antony. Octavian personally entered Alexandria August the 1st, 30 B.C. Legend says that Cleopatra tried to charm Octavian with her feminine wiles as she had done to all these other men previously, only to be repulsed by him. Finally, we have a real man on our hands now. Well, the men would like that. The women would say that sounds like it has overtones of chauvinism. Cleopatra's death remains a mystery. One day she was found dead in her royal robes. The story was circulated that she had had an asp, or two, that is a snake, brought to her secretly. Small marks reportedly discovered on her body were considered proof that she had committed suicide by allowing herself to be bitten by these two poisonous snakes, asps. So according to legend, the legendary aspect of history of the conclusion of the Battle of Actium, that is what's supposed to have taken place. Both Mark Antony and Cleopatra die the death of a suicide. That leaves Octavian, who later takes the name Caesar Augustus as emperor for life and sole ruler of the Mediterranean world. This really doesn't officially come about until the year 27 B.C. He enters Egypt August the 1st, 30 B.C. So 3 years later, that's the date you have on your chart, 30 B.C. whenever Octavian begins to rule, and that's correct. But he takes the title Caesar Augustus and officially is declared emperor for life 3 years later, 27 B.C., and he rules to 14 A.D., which means that he was the emperor in Rome for the first 20 years of the life of the Lord Jesus. He would have been emperor in Rome. Just in summary fashion here, let's state two significant results of the victory of Octavian. We'll discuss a lot more about him and the situation here later on. And I will refer to him probably as Augustus, Caesar Augustus. That was his official designation. First of all, here under Caesar Augustus, beginning in 27 B.C., we have the beginning of the period known as Pax Romana, which I've mentioned the term many times. P-A-X, spelled like it sounds, 2 words, Pax Romana, Roman peace. That lasts for a period of a couple of 100 years. And this is the very area with which we began our study in intertestamental period history by mentioning how this prepared the world for the birth of Christ. If you remember the first 3 tapes here, the fullness of time, it was a period of peace in the world. And it seems like it would have been the perfect time for the Messiah to be born. They were kind of looking for him to be born during a period of great tumult, so that he would come as a revolutionary, as a zealot, as a Jewish zealot, to overthrow whoever was controlling them. But he had enough disturbances and interruptions as it was in Palestine, even in a quiet world. What if he was born during the Maccabean era? What they're trying to do is fight off the Seleucid control. How could they listen then to the spiritual import of his message? All they could hear were political overtones. And for the life of them, during the 1st century A.D., that's all of some of the Jews could hear was political overtones to everything that he said. And it happened to be during a period of peace. And look, it's just by 30 years, or really it's by more like 25 years, but we'll say it's been just by 30 years do we have the period of Roman peace existing so that Christ can be born then. So we have the period of peace known as the Pax Romana. And secondly, under Octavian, he's noted for his tremendous building projects back in Rome. He actually said toward the very end of his life, around AD 13, said, "I found Rome built of sun-dried bricks, and I leave her clothed in marble." And that was true. The building projects in Rome were stupendous during the period of the reign of Augustus Caesar. One final note before we stop tonight. 1 year after the Battle of Actium, 30 BC, Egypt becomes a Roman province. We discussed the end of the Seleucid Syrian Empire before. That was way back up in 64 BC. And notice now we have the end of the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. Whenever Octavian enters, August the 1st, 30 BC, your chart says Egypt becomes property of the Roman emperor under a prefect. That means it becomes an imperial province and not a senatorial province. The senatorial ones were controlled by a legate, and the imperial ones by a prefect. Well, the later term was a procurator.